Hey everyone, welcome to another Talks at Google event. I'm Matt Bonjovi, and I am thrilled to be joined today by Claudia Hammond. Claudia is an award-winning broadcaster, author, and visiting professor in the public understanding of psychology at the University of Sussex. She has written widely acclaimed books, and today, on the Global Day of Unplugging, she is here to talk to us about her newest work, The Art of Rest: How to Find Respite in the Modern Age. There are a lot of books out there about sleep, but the topic of rest is different. In The Art of Rest, Claudia examines the science behind our struggles to rest and relax. The book draws heavily on a 2016 study, the largest study conducted on rest, to present us with a top 10 chart-style countdown of the activities people find most restful. It is a fascinating and enlightening read, and I really recommend it to everyone. Now, throughout the talk, you might have some great questions popping into your head, and when you do, please go ahead and add them to the YouTube chat. We will have time in a bit for Claudia to answer some of these, so be sure to get your questions in early. But first, Claudia, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for inviting me. Very kind of you.
Yeah. So can you start by telling us about the distinction you make between rest and sleep and why that distinction is important?
Yeah, they are very different. So when I'm talking about rest, I'm talking about the relaxing we do while we're awake. So not sleep. Now, sleep is really, really important. And I think sleep has started to be taken much more seriously now. And I want the same to happen for rest. And so when I say rest, it is any activity that you find is relaxing and restorative, an activity that's often intentional and that allows you to escape from your thoughts and distracts you from any worrying thoughts in particular. And so that could be something very active like running, or it could be lying on the sofa doing nothing but being awake. So I'm talking about waking rest, those nice restful moments that seem to be hard to find, where you are able to relax and then you feel a bit better later on.
Yeah. Now, the book draws on a 2016 study that you were involved in called the Rest Test. What was this study and how did it come about?
Yeah, so I was part of a group who had a residency at the Wellcome Collection in London, which is, Wellcome is a huge biomedical researcher funder, and they fund research all over the world, and they have a big base in London on the Euston Road, not far from where Google is based. And they we applied for a residency, a group of us, to actually occupy the top floor for nearly 2 years to look at a particular subject with a whole load of different people. And we won this £1 million grant to do that. And we had artists working with us and philosophers and historians and neuroscientists, all sorts of different people looking at the topic of rest from different perspectives. And what I really wanted to do was to know, well, what do a lot of people think about rest? We did a lot of events with small numbers of people, and I wanted to know, well, what do thousands of people think about this? And because I host radio shows on BBC Radio 4, which is the main speech network for the BBC in the UK, and also on BBC World Service, which has 97 million listeners across a week. We thought it would be the perfect opportunity for a collaboration with the BBC. And so with researchers who were psychologists from Durham University, who were leading the hubbub, the residency that we had, we together devised an online survey, which we called the Rest Test. I launched that on the shows that I host on the BBC, and then we waited to see, was anybody going to be interested in the topic of rest? Would anybody fill this in or not? Anyway, 18,000 people from 135 different countries around the world did fill it in, even though it took quite a long time. It took maybe 35, 40 minutes to fill in because we asked an enormous number of questions. And we measured all sorts of things. We looked at personality, well-being, as well as lots and lots and lots of questions about rest, to see what we could find out about this subject that's been neglected, really, because doctors will sometimes prescribe rest without really saying what that is, and people will interpret that differently. Some people will think, oh, brilliant, I've got to rest. That means I don't have to go to work, but I can go and see my friends or go to the shops. Others might think, oh, I've got to rest, I've got to stay in bed. But what does it actually mean? And that was one of the things we set out to find.
Yeah. So what were some of the top line findings?
Well, we found that there is a real appetite for more rest. So 2/3 of people told us that they would like to get more rest. We looked at levels of well-being and how much rest people got the previous day. And this was really interesting because we found that the average amount of rest that people got the previous day was about 3 hours. But we found that those who wanted more rest and felt they didn't get enough rest had well-being levels only half as high as those who did feel that they got enough rest. If people only say had 1 hour of rest the previous day, their well-being levels were significantly lower than others, but they were also lower if people had loads and loads of rest. So it's not necessarily the case that the more rest the better. It's all about the balance between rest and activity. So we found that if people, say, got 11 hours of rest a day, their well-being levels were actually lower, which might suggest that perhaps they were unemployed and didn't want to be, or perhaps they were ill and couldn't do anything other than rest, and their well-being was lower. The optimum seemed to be between 5 and 6 hours a day, which can sound like ever such a lot, but it depends what you count as restful. You know, for some people, cooking the supper is restful. For others, you know, might hate it and feel it isn't. But those bits of rest can add up in a way.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, and so you mentioned one of those top line findings being that 2/3 of respondents said that they don't feel that they get enough rest. Why is that? What's causing such this rest deficit is the term you use?
Yeah, I think it's intriguing because if you look at time use surveys going back right through the 20th century, if you look at, say, the 1950s, it's not the case that people in the 1950s had loads more spare time than we do. And I think often we're inclined to think that. We think, oh, it's just modern life that's keeping us so busy. Yet it does seem to be the case that we don't feel rested. There weren't any studies on rest done in the 1950s where I can find out what people thought about that. But there does seem to be a feeling that people are overwhelmed by the amount that they've got to do, that their to-do lists feel overwhelming, and that they almost feel they should be busy. And I think there's a real change that's taken place here. If you look at writings, literature about, say, 19th century, 18th century gentlemen, they usually were gentlemen of leisure, they would write, say, about going off to their country retreat with their friends and doing all sorts of country pursuits and then coming back to their city clubs and the nice times they were having. And they would talk about these publicly and without any sense of embarrassment that they weren't necessarily doing much work as such. And I think that's really changed. If you look now on something like Instagram, you see people, you see rich celebrities will sometimes be on holiday, not much these days, but sometimes they might be on holiday. But a lot of the time, they're showing you what they're doing. They're showing you that they're busy. And I think part of the difficulty now is that busyness has become what some refer to as something of a badge of honor, and that it's better to be busy. And in fact, there is research that backs this up. Unfortunately, we do think busy people are better. So there was a study done by a psychologist in America called Sylvia Bellessa. And what they did in that study was give people some fictional Facebook status updates from a fictional character called Sally Fisher. And for half the people, they had a busy version of Sally. And so Sally Fisher would write on a Wednesday lunchtime, 1 p.m., no time to stop for lunch. I'm going to grab a sandwich, come back to my desk. At 5 p.m. on Friday, she'd say, the weekend feels far away for me. I've got loads of work left to do. And then there was a less busy version of Sally Fisher. And on a Wednesday, she would say at 1 p.m., I'm stopping now for a nice hour-long lunch break. And at 5 on Friday, she would say, that's it, I'm done for the weekend. And then they asked people what they thought of her. Interestingly, people didn't say those are rather dull status updates that maybe you don't want to bother with. But they didn't say that, no. But what they did say was that they thought the busy Sally was more organized, probably better at multitasking, and had a more interesting and meaningful job. And they just got that from those few little phrases. So the trouble is that we do think that busy people are better. And so, you know, if I bump into someone I know and they say, how are you? I'll say, oh, well, busy, you know, they'll say, how's work? And I'll say, oh, fine, but very busy, you know, a bit too busy, really. And it, you know, can feel like that. But also, how much is that a claim to status of saying, you know, look how in demand I am, look how important I am, I'm so busy. And so I think sometimes we feel we should be busy and then feel guilty if we're not busy. And so I think particularly during the early lockdowns, the first lockdown, it was very evident that there seemed to be a pressure almost to do lockdown well. If people hadn't got their jobs at the moment and weren't working, that they should at least be baking perfect sourdough bread and learning the piano and another language and doing all these sorts of things, and that you had to people would ask you, what are you doing in lockdown then, and you needed to have succeeded. Whereas it's also hard that just getting through this time is success in my book, and that's absolutely fine. You don't need to have achieved anything, just surviving it is achieving. And so I think those pressures are on us. I think the second thing is that the wonders of new technology, of course, do mean that they blur the boundaries between what's work and what's leisure. And of course, a lot of people have found that working from home, why stop at any particular moment when you could just do a little bit more and then a little bit more and a little bit more if you haven't got to travel anywhere. And so I think that makes us feel more restless. The fact that your boss might not email you at 11 at night, but your boss can email you at 11 at night. And it's incredibly tempting to look at your emails just before you go to sleep, which is a massive mistake, because if someone says something that's annoying, then there's nothing you can do about it at all until you're working next day, but it might stop you sleeping. But it's very, very difficult to resist doing that. And so I think that part of our work life has merged into our leisure time, and that makes us feel less rested as well. It's almost a bit, if you talk to, say, air stewards who are on call, they may have to go on a flight, but they may not. And I can remember I used to, know one very well. And we used to say to him, "Oh, you're so lucky. You're being paid to just do nothing for 3 days." And he said, "But it's not like that, because I may have to go somewhere, and that spoils it. And then it's not restful. It's restless."
Yeah. Yeah. And so, as you said, with the 2/3 of people self-reporting that they think they don't get enough rest, people are aware of this as being something that they think they want. And you certainly underline the costs that exist to not getting enough rest. You have some statistics in the book where you say, in the UK, 500,000 people are suffering from work-related stress, or in the US, 13% of injuries at work can be attributed to fatigue. And even the most startling one I thought was that 16% of people in one study have admitted to falling asleep recently while driving.
Yeah.
So the motivation for taking this seriously is there, and people are at least somewhat aware that they need to be resting more. How do we go about tackling this then? How do we get better at rest?
Yeah, so I think the first thing is to appreciate why rest is good for you and why it matters, and that rest is not a lazy thing. That because this is not a charter for laziness. This is saying work out how much rest you need and work out how you can fit that in. So the first step is to appreciate why it is good for you cognitively, mentally. We know, there are plenty of studies. It improves people's memory and concentration. There was a really interesting study from South Korea where people just have micro breaks. So really short 1 or 2 minute breaks in an office. And they have these micro breaks at least once an hour. And they might stare out of the window for a couple of minutes, or go and get a drink and bring it back to their desk. So, not long at all, or just they were allowed to lean back in their chair and shut their eyes for a moment. And they were instructed to do this every hour. And their levels of concentration and attention were measured, and so was their well-being at the end of the day. And they actually, every time they had one of these micro breaks for an hour, they would concentrate better. And so it's not even that you'll get less done if you rest. So I think the first step is to value it in that way, and to think about how it improves your memory. There's an amazing study that I really liked that was done in Scotland, where they got people to do a simple memory task, learning long lists of words, a classic memory task within psychology. And then they had half the people go and sit in a darkened room for 10 minutes, and the other half had to do a different task, but a very easy task, but they were concentrating on that for a while. The people who had the break remembered significantly more of the words when they were asked to afterwards. But the really staggering thing is that then they did this with people with amnesia. And people with amnesia, because they cannot make new memories, find it very, very difficult to learn lists of words. And usually they can get 14% right of those words. If they learn, say, 100 words, they can just get 14 of them. So it's very, very low. But if they had a 10-minute break in a darkened room, that shot up to 49%, which is really remarkable for people with amnesia. And the other thing it's really important for is our mental health as well. And so we need to start appreciating. The very first step is definitely to appreciate why it's good for us, so that you don't need to feel guilty when you decide that you're going to do something restful.
Yeah, that makes sense. And you point out that that sort of high achieving athletes tend to do this, where they will actually put in specific blocks of rest in their schedule. Is that something that
Yeah.
should been helpful?
Yeah, yeah, it is. And so, yes, athletes they know that you cannot train all the time and perform all the time, that you have to build in rest as well. And that's a very important thing. And so something we can do is to build rest in to our timetables and to prescribe yourself some rest, if you like. Think of it as I call it a prescription for rest. And so in the middle of every afternoon, particularly when I'm working from home, the thing I find most restful, and it is different for everybody, so it's a question of finding the activity you find most restful. The thing I find really restful is gardening. I absolutely love it. And so I will, in the middle of the afternoon, just go outside for 15 minutes into the garden and potter about and deadhead a few things and see how things are growing. I've got a tiny greenhouse. I'll go in and have a look at how my seedlings are doing and what's happening. And I can feel the waves of relaxation, if you like, coming over me, and I can feel I'm stopping thinking about the work things I'm doing. And so, and I used to sometimes be tempted to just do that anyway, because I just love going out there. But I did used to feel guilty about it. I think, oh, I ought to be working. Now I don't, because I think this is good for my mental health. And to protect my mental health, I'm going to go outside for 15 minutes and do this thing that I find restful. And the difference when you come back is amazing. And I think the trouble is that, particularly if you have work where you have deadlines, one thing a German study found that we often do is if we have deadlines, we save the rewards for when we finish. So we decide, well, I'll just get this done and then I'll go and get a cup of tea. It would be, if you possibly can, much better to say, right, I've got to get this done. I've only got half an hour. I'm just going to get a quick cup of tea, bring that back and carry on with it, because then you will work more productively and faster in that half an hour, just because you had a break of a few minutes to make your cup of tea. But we're always tempted to do it the other way around, to think, I'll just do this, and we force ourselves to do it when we could be doing it the other way around and doing that much more easily. But I think giving ourselves permission to rest is really key. I mean, we found that 9% of people felt guilty whenever they rest. And people sometimes we asked people what words they associated with rest in the rest test. And people said things like stress inducing, frustrating, hard to achieve. So I think a first step is definitely giving ourselves permission and accepting that it is useful, acknowledging that it's useful before working out the best ways for you to do it.
Yeah, that makes sense. And one of the things that you highlighted there was that it's important that you understand what is restful for you. One of the things I like about the book is that you go through the top 10 results that people have reported as the activities that they find most restful. And I wanted to dig into that list a little bit. So clocking in at number 9 is watching TV. And this is an activity that a lot of people use in order to get rest, but it stands out because it doesn't have the same cultural cachet as some of the other items on the list, like meditation or reading. Why is TV looked down on as a form of rest, and how does this impact how people use it to rest?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. You get these phrases like, TV rots your brain, or where, you're couch potatoes if you watch TV. And by TV, we counted anything that was on a screen. It didn't have to be live broadcast TV, but it could be anything that was moving pictures, basically. And what I thought was interesting was that so more women and more young people put this down. And I think that TV has got a bit of a bad rap. And if you look at studies, it is true that if people watch very, very large amounts of TV, so a huge Brazilian study found that if people watched 5 to 6 hours of TV every day, they were more likely to develop depression or symptoms of depression than people who watched less. But they also found that people who watched less than 1 hour a day were also not as happy as the people who watched some. So I think it is all a question of degree here. Yes, obviously don't watch it all the time. But also, if you think about some studies, sometimes the people who are watching an enormous amount of TV, again, it might be that they're ill or they're unemployed and they haven't got something else to do, and so their main alternative is to watch TV. So that may not be what's causing their lack of well-being. That could come from other things. But yes, too much is not a good idea. But I think that I think it's really interesting that TV did come in the top 10 when things like gardening didn't, and socializing didn't. Those weren't in the top 10, or eating out, that wasn't in the top 10, eating meals. So I think it's interesting that it did. And I think one of the reasons people like it is that nothing is required of you while you watch TV. You can do it happily alongside somebody else and in happy companionship, if you like. So we know from studies that 20% of the time while people watch TV, they are talking. And so you can talk if you want to. You share a story that you're watching together. You watch that unfold. You get to see what the other person thinks about that as well. But you don't have to talk. You can just be involved in it and be there side by side. And I think it's really instructive that many of the activities which people said were restful were things that they do on their own. And watching TV is something where you might not be on your own, but you're almost on your own. Nothing's required. You haven't got to think of anything to say. But there are studies. I mean, in Germany, there was a study, they actually called it the guilty couch potato, which I liked, which was the title of the paper. And they found that if people felt guilty when they watched TV, then they felt less refreshed afterwards. So if you are going to watch TV, and of course, a lot of people are, we know there's a lot more video and TV viewing of all kinds going on at the moment because of the not being able to go out and do other things in many places. And so I think it's a question of not feeling guilty about it, and also choosing something memorable, because my previous book was on time perception and how we perceive time passing. And one of the ways we look at how much time has passed is by how many new memories we've made. And so if we don't remember what we watch, then we don't make many new memories if it wasn't very memorable, and then it makes it feel as if time has gone fast. So I think it's good to choose something that's memorable. But I also think that wanting to watch other people's stories or hear other people's stories is as old as time. Some people have referred to the TV as the electronic hearth, that these screens that we gather around them a bit like people used to gather around fires and tell stories. It's just that these stories are realized for us by the best actors and directors in the world, and brilliantly made by teams of people. And so we're just watching human stories, which I think is something that people always want to do, because it takes you out of yourself and it takes you away from those thoughts whirring around in your head. And I think a lot of the most successful restful activities are the ones that do take you away from those thoughts.
Yeah, that makes sense. And another thing that you point out is that studies find that retired people watch more TV than younger people, yet younger people rate TV as more restful. Can you talk a bit about that discrepancy?
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And I think that might be to do with the fact that younger people have got less time free to watch TV than retired people, and so for them it might be more of a treat, whereas I think for the older people sometimes it is how they're filling their day in some cases, particularly if you think of, say, people in retirement homes where they're often sitting in a room where the TV is the only activity that's happening, and I think that also for older people sometimes the TV can be company in a very good way, in a useful way, that they're looking to the TV for different things than the younger people are. And so I think it might not be able to be purely restful because it's more of a general activity, whereas for the younger people it's their treat when they get to sit and flop down and relax and binge watch some box sets.
Yeah, that makes sense. So I want to jump ahead then down to the number one item on the list, and it comes in with an impressive 58% of respondents selecting it as restful, and that's reading. What is it
this
about?
was interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, we were surprised actually, because reading takes effort. It takes cognitive effort. You've got to look at what's on the page. You've got to make sense of those letters, words. There may be words you don't know what they mean, and then you've got to relate them to what's happened beforehand. Perhaps think about how they relate to your own experiences, your own life, or other people's lives. What you think about those characters. There's ever such a lot going on here to think about, and so it's very different from, say, it feels very different from lying on the sofa watching TV. It does take more effort. And yet so many people chose it. And we did wonder, were people just trying to look good by saying that they put down reading a bit like, everyone puts down reading on their university applications, whether they like it or not. And so we did wonder whether that was what was going on. And yet, doing nothing also came in the top 10, came very high, and people were happy to admit that they like doing nothing. So I think we have to take people at their word on this. People who scored, we gave people a scale that measures what's known as flourishing. And this is fulfilling your potential, finding meaning in life, and generally feeling happy in that particular kind of way. And we found reading was more commonly put down by those who scored very high on flourishing. I think what is special about reading is that it allows us to escape from our own lives. It allows us, again, which I think is so important, to escape from those stressful thoughts. But it also allows us to empathize with someone else's story, whether it's fiction or non-fiction, and to reflect on that, and then to reflect back on your own life. And in a way, you can be alone, which we've seen is very much valued by people in this list, but with company, because you have the company of the characters. And it allows us to daydream. So it can be a really good jumping off point for thinking about other things. And we know that you can measure, using eye tracking devices, you can measure people's reading and what they're reading, where they are on the page, and whether they are concentrating. Because as you read, your eyes go across and down and across and down and across and down. But when you get to a word that's unfamiliar or longer, you slightly pause and your eyes slightly pause. But if you're not concentrating while you read, but your eyes carry on moving down the page, they do it at an absolutely regular rate. So you can tell whether people are concentrating or not. And it turns out quite a lot of the time people aren't. And psychologists call this mindless reading, which I think is slightly judgmental, but there we are. So they call it mindless reading. And what it means is that, and we've all had this, you get to the bottom of the page, you think, oh, I've taken in none of that. You read it again, you get to the bottom, you've taken in none of it because you're thinking about something else. But I think that's okay. Even if it's my book, I think that's okay. I think that if it provides you with a jumping off point for daydreaming, as long as daydreaming isn't about persistent negative thoughts that we'd call rumination, then daydreaming is fine and can be good for you and is creative and lets your mind free and lets you make sense of what's going on in your life, what's happening, lets you think about your relationships. It lets you think about what might happen in the future. There's a lot of benefits to daydreaming. And so I don't think it matters that people do that. I think that's okay. And I think that might be one of the reasons that people like reading so much and that reading came out so high.
Yeah, that makes sense. And does it matter really what you read? Does it need to be kind of funny or light or heavy?
Well, it's interesting. We didn't ask people what they were reading. It could be anything. But what I've done in each of these chapters is to look right across the world at the best research that's been done on those things. And when I looked at the research on reading, much of it's from South Africa. Actually, there's a particular researcher in South Africa, Victor Nell, who's done lots of research on this, and it doesn't seem to matter. You know, some people do like nonfiction better, and some people like fiction better. What matters is, it's a bit like with listening to music, which also appears in the top 10. What matters is whether you like that thing or not. What they have found in some studies is that more complex stories, they've done studies using short stories to try to help people to deal with chronic pain, to try and distract them. And one thing they've found there is that more complex stories seem to be more engaging and more distracting. And I think sometimes people think if they're going on holiday and there's traditional sort of holiday literature is something really easy, but actually because you've got lots of time to really get into things, that might actually be the time to read something more complex instead, and that's harder because you've really got time to get into it. So I think it doesn't matter what you're reading as long as you like what you're reading. Some studies have looked at, say, reading magazines. That will do too. That's okay as well. There's just something about it taking you out of your world that you're in at this moment. And what we do know is that people look for meaning in what they read. So in one study they were giving people different things to read, like books about collecting gemstones. And if you're interested in that, then that's great. And because that's the thing that will distract you and make you feel rested.
Yeah. And I was wondering, as I was reading this, if there's any risk of going back to the issue where there's this sort of badge of honor to looking busy, and reading kind of has this busyness to it. Was that at all discussed?
Yeah, I think, yes, what you don't want, and I think with all of these things, with rest as a whole, what you don't want is rest to be yet another thing to do on your to-do list, because then that's kind of defeats the object of it. So yes, I think if reading becomes something that feels competitive, so if obviously, reading groups are very popular now, but if it starts to feel as if it's your homework that you haven't done for your reading group, then that might be a time to think about whether you do want to, what you are getting out of being in the reading group, and whether it's spoiling something that could be restful by making it feel like a chore. Because I think a really important thing about rest is that it is intentional, and that you choose to do it, that you're not forced to do it, because enforced rest we know isn't restful. And I think that's interesting it has been interesting in the pandemic, if for people who haven't been able to do their jobs, that rather than have a lovely time, in fact what they're having is enforced rest, which is really difficult. So if you think people in prison get a lot of time to rest, and in some situations, and particularly during a pandemic, people in prison may have 24 hours in their cell. So that's loads of time to rest, but they will tell you that doesn't feel restful at all, that actually what they feel is restless. So if it's enforced, then it's no good.
Yeah, that makes sense. In the chapter on reading, you have you detail this fascinating study where researchers aggregated thousands of personal stories from the internet into essentially these 40 key narratives. Can you walk us through this study and kind of highlight how it looks at the universality of storytelling?
Yeah, this was amazing, actually. This was done at the University of Southern California. And so they took 20 million personal stories that were posted on blogs all around the world. And they used software that could tell what was happening in the stories. And they managed to distill it into just 40 tales, and in a way suggesting there are just 40 stories of what happens, of love, death, and all sorts of different things that can happen to people. But then they put people in brain scanners, and they looked to see how their brains responded when they were reading the different stories from these 40 distilled stories. And some were reading it in English, others were reading it in Farsi, and others were reading it in Mandarin Chinese. And they were very deliberately chosen because obviously those languages have different alphabets and are written in different directions on the page. And so they looked at how their brain processes the stories, and whichever language they were reading them in, the people's brains responded in a very similar way. And in whether individuals like the story or not, their brains seem to respond in a very similar way, but differently for different stories. And this is where it was really remarkable. So it seems that the way that we process different stories seems to be quite universal, but they were quite good, better than chance, at guessing what stories people were reading by looking at the activity in their brain, which is really sort of remarkable because that's almost mind reading, which brain scanners can't really do. So that was extraordinary that they could see the response. But the main point when it came to rest was that while they were reading these stories, their brain wasn't always focused. They were using some of the areas that we know people use when they daydream. It's called the default mode network. And they were using those areas and thinking about other things. And I think this probably points to the fact that one of the things we do while we read is we find meaning in what we read, and we relate that to our own lives. And even if we're, reading something written 2 centuries before about somebody's story, we still relate that to our own lives and what we see around us. And so their brains weren't resting, and their brains also weren't necessarily focused, but all sorts of activity was going on in finding this meaning. And I think, again, that might show why it's so absorbing and so distracting and successful for trying to rest.
Yeah, that makes sense. So obviously things have changed quite a bit this past year, and we've touched a little bit on how rest has changed in the COVID era. But can you give us kind of the top line view of what's different about today?
Yeah, so I think what is different is that people are separated into very different groups. So there are some people who have been furloughed and whose jobs, or lost their jobs altogether, who now don't have work. There's been, of course, another group of people, and in particular in hospitals, who are working harder than they have ever worked before in really difficult, sometimes traumatic circumstances. And then there's a group of people trying to work from home with all the challenges and technological challenges and other challenges, personal challenges that can have, and of course trying to sometimes deal with homeschooling their children at the same time. So for those people, it has absolutely, definitely not been a restful time. But likewise, for those who don't have work, it's not necessarily being restful. It can be restless, but it will vary a lot with individuals. So there are some people who have loved this time. And it's interesting, if you look at the very, very early on in the pandemic, a lot of mental health research began following people's mental health over the time. And the mental health of 10% of people has improved during the pandemic. Although, of course, for a lot of people, it has got worse. And I think it's really interesting how there are these different reactions depending on your circumstances, because if you were doing a job that you hated going to, or were being bullied at work, say, in one go, the pandemic sorted that out for a while at least, and that couldn't be done anymore. So I think if you were someone who hated going to wherever you had to go, suddenly you don't have to. I've also interviewed on my shows people with say social anxiety, or some people with depression and anxiety, who found that suddenly everyone isn't trying to make them do things, and that they being at home is what you're allowed to do, and so they suddenly don't feel left out anymore, and don't feel that people are trying to pressurize them to do what they don't want to. So I think it will be really interesting to see what happens afterwards with that, whether some people find it very hard to do things again after they've got out of practice of it. On the other hand, we do know that old habits die hard, and we did have years and years of doing things in what we thought was a normal way before this happened. So I think it will take some adjustment, but I think for many the adjustment will be very quick. It will be very odd the first time you go to a pub, and not nearly as odd the second time.
Yeah. Now, with COVID, people have gained back their commute in some sense, but for many, their caring responsibilities have skyrocketed, often leading to a net loss in their free time. This loss is, of course, not even. For example, women take on a far greater percentage of caretaking on average than men. What recommendations do you have for people who really are struggling to find time to rest?
Yeah, I think it's really difficult, and particularly if everyone is there all the time. And I think for some people, it was the case that their commute was the restful bit. Lots of people will moan about commuting, but actually it is time you get not exactly on your own. There's other people around, but you're alone with your thoughts. And I know that some people have found it's really useful to commute to work at the start of their day, even though they're working from home, to walk around the block, even if it's only 5 minutes. It's very good to get outside every day, and work can suddenly take over and you can do that. But to think, well, this was my home life. Now I'm going out around the block. Now I'm starting work, and then to try and end that at the end of the day. Now, absolutely not possible for everybody. And of course, not always possible if you've got children coming in and out during the day as well. I think the thing that people can do is to try to spot any unexpected opportunities for rest, and to spot that something they're doing feels restful even though they haven't thought about it. Almost consciously look for what am I doing in my day, which might be cooking, that does feel more restful than the other bits. And I think noticing that you're getting some rest goes a bit of a way towards making people feel better. Another thing people can do is to reframe wasted time as rest. So if you go to the supermarket and the queue is quite long when you get to the counter, excuse me, is to think, instead of thinking, oh, I can't believe it, I'm going to have to queue here for 15 minutes and I haven't got time because I've got so many things to do, isn't this annoying, is to think instead, if somebody had said to you, I tell you what, you can have 15 minutes to do nothing at all apart from just look at the world go by, then you may think, oh, I quite like that, that would be lovely. So I think it's of thinking that time in the queue rather than feeling impatient about it, to try and think, actually, I deserve this 15-minute rest. I'm just going to lean on my trolley for a while and I'm just going to have a little rest. And yeah, maybe I could be looking at my phone and doing my emails, but actually, no, I'm just, I'm buying the food that's got to be done. So I'm going to have a rest. So I think you can do things like trying to find those moments. Another thing to do, I think, is to accept that your to-do list will never end, and that is okay, and that you will always have a to-do list, and that is okay. And so I think people often want to get to the end of it and can't feel rested or settled until they do. And the trouble is that even if you do that, the next day there will be something else. Pipes will leak, things will go wrong, people get ill, surprise things happen, the dog escapes, things go on. So I think that in a way, thinking we can ever be done with it, and now life is just normal and straightforward, it never is really. And so don't feel you have to get to the end of the list. Instead think, well, I could do that today, I could do that right now, but you know what? I'm not going to. I'm going to look after myself, and I'm going to look after my mental health and everybody else by resting myself.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think one of the things I found with COVID is when there's this global scale disaster, you really do appreciate that it is chaotic, and to sort of make peace with that does help you find rest.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think that I've had so many people say, you say, how are you? And they say, oh, well, I'm fine, but it's a bit hard at the moment. It's really going on, isn't it? And then they say, but I really can't complain because, of course, there's people who've lost people and there's people who's really ill. And so I think people feel guilty about feeling bad at all. And I think it's okay to feel bad at the moment. It's okay to grieve the loss. We've lost our old lives, and that's a massive big deal for everybody, even if you are a lucky one who does have somewhere to work at home that isn't sitting on your bed. You can still be luckier than other people and still find it hard. And I think don't add the guilt of finding it hard onto everything else. It's difficult and it's horrible.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. So we have a few audience questions that I wanted to jump to. The first one we have is from Luke, and he asks, is reading news/social media considered restful?
That's a really interesting question. And in fact, what is interesting is that even when we left a completely blank box, not suggesting any activities at all, and I asked people what activities they found restful, apart from, you could count watching TV, but apart from that, nothing that was online came in the top 20. So, surfing the web did not come in the top 20, neither did social media. Now, that doesn't mean people don't enjoy those things, but of course, we weren't asking people what they enjoy, because also it's notable that socializing didn't come high either, and many people do enjoy that but don't find it necessarily restful. So I think that people may enjoy it but not find it restful, and I think part of the reason why it might not be restful is the surprise nature in a way. If you don't know what's going to come up, and that you can, depending on who you follow, what you're looking at, that you can see people arguing and that sort of thing. And so I think social media is not inherently restful, and yet it's a way that we instinctively fill our breaks now, that we go to look to see what's happened, and that maybe it's not always the best way of filling our breaks. I mean, I am skeptical of some of I think that there's this kind of all screens are all bad and all terrible. I'm skeptical of some of the research on that, because I think it massively depends on what you're doing. And I think the screen time full stop is, there's not good evidence that that's a damaging thing. It all depends on what you are doing.
Yeah. And I think there's been this increasing awareness that people realize that when they're going into social media, they don't necessarily know what they're going for or what they're going to get out of it. And I think that underlies your point. Yeah. So the next question we have is from Alexia, and they ask, any tips on how to relax and rest when doing a lockdown staycation at home?
Yes, that's a very good question, because I think what you need to do is to make it feel very different from the time when you were working. And of course, that's difficult because we're in the same rooms, we've got all the same cues going on and the things that remind you of work. So I think one is to put away anything you can that is associated with work. And I think particularly generally, if for people who are, and I know, a quarter of under 25s are working in their bedrooms, which is really, really tough, because that's the place that should be devoted to sleeping in order for you to sleep well. And so I think what's really important is to try to put away anything associated with work. If you can, put the laptop in a cupboard, so you could literally, so you can't see those cues associated with work, so that it's your staycation, and to try to make it different and to try to do different things each day on that staycation, hopefully that you weren't doing the rest of the time. Now that's difficult because obviously the options are limited, like, another walk in the park, but to take some walks in some different directions and to go and try to explore the roads, the ways that you have never been down, to find what is there. Because again, it's about time perception and about building up memories. You want to be able to remember something from that staycation for it to feel different from the rest of your life, for it to feel refreshing. So I think then it's a question of maybe thinking of some activities that you haven't done at all, to do something creative, something a bit different, but without putting pressure on yourself for it to have to be something that's brilliant or achieving something.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point. People talk about the lockdowns being this sort of blur where you don't really know where time has gone. And it sounds like finding those times to be able to have memories that are different are quite
Yeah.
important.
Yeah, so that you can tag those times. So I think, for example, in in the UK, we had snow a few weeks ago, and I think that made some memories for people to remember, because that looked a bit different, and so those bit of times will be easier. But I think one of the things we will find going on is that we won't know quite when things happened, because we don't have those timestamps. And there is already some evidence that if you've been finding your memory has been a bit worse during lockdown, that is completely normal, partly because we don't have the cues around us to remind us to do things. So if you're finding you're forgetting that you're supposed to have emailed somebody about something, if you were in an office, you might walk past the room where you had a meeting that was to do with that, and that would remind you, and you think, oh, I must do that, must get on with that. But all the time, if you're in the same room with the same screen, you haven't got any of those things to remind you. It's hard to even remember the conversations you had with people, because all of those other things are not there. And we also know that when people move around geographically, we see more activity in the hippocampus, which is associated with autobiographical memory in the brain, and that is triggered by leaving your home, if you like, because whenever you leave your home and go somewhere else, you start to notice things around you more, because we always find our way back home. So we start to deliberately notice what's going on in order that we can find our way back to safety all the time. And you don't have that if you hardly ever leave your home. So your memory is not in a way prompted in the same way to do the things it needs to do. So if you find your memory is not as good at the moment, that's completely normal. It will come back.
Yeah, that's great to hear. So the next question is from Michael, who asks, how much time is considered effective rest? How can we maximize our rest time?
Yeah, really good question. So what we found in the rest test was that the people with the highest well-being had 5 to 6 hours of rest the previous day. Now that sounds like ever such a long time, and I think trying to deliberately build in 5 to 6 hours is difficult. But I think trying to think, well, what are the things that are restful, and can those add up? And even building in micro breaks if you can't do the bigger breaks. But I think it's a question of choosing 2 or 3 of the activities that really make you feel really different after you've done them. And they will be different for different people. They don't necessarily have to be within this top 10. I refer a lot in the book to the other sorts of activities that people may find restful, but to really think about how you can use those activities. So listening to music came at number 4. So then to think and again, it's not a particular type of music. It all depends on what you find restful. But you can deliberately decide, do you know what, I'm going to just listen, even if it's one track, I'm just going to now sit and listen to something that I really, really like, and then get on with what I'm doing. And it's to try and build in those restful moments into your day is I think really important.
Yeah, I wanted to go back actually to another question I had. So another item on the list is number 6, which is a good walk, which is definitely familiar, I think, to people in lockdowns. This one is also interesting because it has a physical component that might not immediately be thought of as restful. Can you talk a bit about how physical exhaustion can work as a form of rest?
Yeah, it's really interesting. So 38% of people put down walking as the thing that they found restful, and 15% put exercise, and 8% put running. And some people, particularly if people don't like running, then they will think, oh, how could running ever be restful? It's horrible and exhausting. But I think for some people, they can't rest their mind and stop those thoughts whirring around until they've exerted their body. And so the key thing is if you are one of those people, to find the ways that you can exert your body. And then it's almost as if once your body is exhausted and tired out, then as you're doing that, you're concentrating on that so hard that you're distracted from those thoughts which were stressing you out, and that allows people to really relax. And I think that walking is interesting because it's sort of perfect pace in a way. It's fast enough to distract us, because it's every 30 seconds you're in front of something different, so you're seeing something different. So it's fast enough to distract us, but it's slow enough to allow our minds to wander, and to not have to concentrate too hard. And I think it's interesting that in long distance runners, they find different patterns of connection in the brain that are similar to those that they see in very experienced meditators who've done 50,000 hours of meditation. And I think that there is something very special about walking being restful. And I think that increasingly, I mean, a lot of people have found that with the limited number of activities that we can do at the moment, that this is one that has made a real difference to them. And that if people can't get out for their walk each day, that they can really note, because maybe it's raining or they've been working, they really notice that difference there. But what is really interesting is that of these 10 activities, all of the top 10 activities actually can be done during lockdowns. And 8 of them, apart from going out for a walk or going into nature, can even be done while people are self-isolating, which is, complete chance. And that's what people said long before the pandemic. And I think that's really interesting, quite hopeful that we at least we can still do some of these things.
Yeah, that's a great point. And still on walking as the theme, so you also talk about there's the flip side to this, where you mentioned that we're kind of in the age of the quantified self, where we track many things about our activities, especially our step count. Does this gamification of walking have any impact on its restfulness?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I'm fascinated by step counting, actually, and I do it myself quite obsessively. But I'm quite, and I don't like looking now because it's even though I go running, it's so low now in lockdown, just because I'm not doing the normal walking about, going to work and going out and so on. What is really interesting is that it can take away the satisfaction of walking, and there can be this feeling that a walk only counts if you've got your step counter. I have to admit, I have gone back for my phone before now, because otherwise it wouldn't count and I'd lose my steps. So there was a study in the US that was looking at walking for weight loss, and they found that the people who counted steps actually seemed to lose less weight in the end. There was also some interesting research again from the States which found that people, if people had step counters and a goal, they walked further, but many enjoyed it less. So I think it is important to not take the joy of walking out of it if you are trying to quantify it, because it becomes another task to do. It becomes another achievement that, oh, I haven't done this, and it may spoil what you're finding from walks. There was some really interesting research it came out a few months ago that you may have heard about on All Walks, so Or AWE, and this was amazing. They had people just go for 15-minute walks. They were people over the age of 60, and half of them just went for a walk, and they had to take selfies every so often to prove that they did. And half of them had to look for things that struck awe in them. And they could be in nature. It could be a beautiful tree or a tiny leaf or something like that. Or it could be human-made. It could be an amazing building where you think, how on earth did they build that tower? Where did they even start with that bridge? That sort of thing. You can look for anything that makes you feel awestruck. And they had to deliberately look for it. And they found that the people who went for the awe walks, by the end of it, of several weeks, they had higher levels of pro-social feelings, so nice feelings about other people. They had higher levels of well-being, but also, and this was really interesting, and they weren't expecting this was a surprise finding, they got them to take the selfies and just to check that they were doing what they were supposed to be doing. But what they found was that the people who were doing the awe walks over time gradually made themselves smaller in the selfies and the background bigger, almost as if they started to care more and more about the whole world and looking at the bigger picture of the world, because they'd done this looking for things that are awestruck. And what's amazing is once you start doing awe walks, you can't stop. And the moment I read about this research and I interviewed the person who did it, every walk I go on now, I just can't help but look for things where you think, oh, isn't that lovely? Isn't that amazing? And it's just really nice, and it gives you something, particularly if you're doing the same walks again and again because of limited places you can go, then it gives a really nice element to it and does make a difference.
Yeah. So as we wrap up, the last topic I wanted to touch on, you have a line in your book where, after discussing some of the negative impacts of lack of rest, specifically having restful alone time, you point out that these findings have led for calls for leaders of business who are forever in meetings and they're sort of at the mercy of their open door policy, for them to spend more time alone in order to come to the right ethical decisions. How important is it for leaders to take times for themselves, and how should people go about doing this?
It's really important and really difficult, because often, and again, particularly, with endless online meetings. So it is really important to try to have some time to actually think about what you're trying to do. And the problem is that leaders' diaries will often get absolutely filled with with meetings. So I think one way to do it, particularly if somebody has somebody else filling their diary for them, is to put in time where they are not going to be not going to have meetings, but also not just use that time to read all the emails that they couldn't read while they were in the meeting, because I think having time to think is really important. And this is what I mean. In fact, going for a walk could be the thing that people could do here. And there have been and in fact, walking meetings. So there's also been interesting research on walking meetings and how those people walking side by side can often feel that they can talk more frankly. And you haven't got the distraction of seeing someone else's eyes, of having that eye contact with somebody. And people will have, it's sometimes called porch sitting, when people sit next to, many people will find that they sit next to their teenager in the car, that might be the best time to try to have difficult, awkward conversations with them where you don't have to look at each other. So I think what leaders can do is to try to find time when they can really think on their own, because to allow them to have some rest, to take stock, to think what is it they want to do, what is the bigger thing that they need to do next. And I think that often it's tempting for leaders not to get any rest either, and tempting for everyone to think that rest isn't a good thing. And I think leaders should be also allowing their staff to rest, and it should be okay for your boss to walk in and for you to have your eyes shut for a second, not to be sleeping for the afternoon, but to be having a 2-minute micro break where you've just shut your eyes for a while, should be okay and should be allowed. And I think that what the main thing leaders can do is to try to stop any presenteeism where people feel they must stay till a certain time to look as if they're working hard. It is okay to have breaks, and actually they will work better if they have breaks. It's a good thing for everybody.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. And that's all the time we have. Claudia, I want to thank you again for joining us. It's been a pleasure talking with you today.
You're very welcome. Thank you so much for having me. And thanks for all those good questions there as well.
Absolutely. So Claudia's book, The Art of Rest, is available now wherever books are sold, and especially at your local booksellers. I really do recommend it. For everyone who joined us, we look forward to seeing you at our next Talks at Google event. Please stay safe and take care.